I'm August Ragone, the author of Eiji Tsuburaya, Master of Monsters. Ever since I was a kid, I was obsessed by all monsters. But I especially got interested in Japanese monsters some way, somehow, and it's pretty much ruined my life. There was this big thing that happened in Japan about the middle 60s that the Japanese media labeled the monster boom. And there were several different popularity booms or pop culture booms in Japan that the media covered. One of them in the early 60s was a ninja boom. And there was like ninja TV shows and movies and manga and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. There was the monster boom, which had been coming to a boiling point from Toho's Godzilla and other monster movies that they were making. The other studios just couldn't compete with Toho, but they felt compelled, since there was this nexus point that everything was building to, that was coming to a crescendo when Tsuburaya especially released their TV series Ultra Q, the precursor to Ultraman. That erupted across the media. It became a phenomenon just not for kids. It became just nationwide. It was the thing that people talked about at the water cooler the next day at work. Did you watch Ultra Q last night? What is Ultra Q? It was basically the Outer Limits and the Twilight Zone mixed with Godzilla on a weekly half-hour basis in glorious 35mm black and white. So that turned the nation into monster mania. All of a sudden the other studios said, we need to make our own monster. So you had Nikatsu Studios did Gappa, the Triphibian Monster, which was released in the United States as Monster from a Prehistoric Planet. Shochiku Studios, which usually just did, romantic films and, these just very, very kind of slushy family entertainment. They completely whacked out the X from outer space with the monster Gulala, the atomic chicken from Mars or wherever. And they did all these crazy movies, and then everybody started just producing their TV shows, anime, movies, television shows about monsters. And out of that, Daiei, which was probably the second best studio next to Toho in terms of what they could produce and the caliber of stars, they decided to launch their own monster series. Kind of got the jump on everybody. A month before Ultra Q premiered on January 2nd, 1966, in December of '65, Daiei released Gamera, the Giant Monster. And the film was an unexpected hit. The director was a neophyte director. None of the really good directors at the studio who did epic films with a lot of special effects and cast of thousands, historical dramas. These guys went, I'm not directing one of those. Give it to that guy, the son of this famous star called Noriaki Yuasa, and he became solely attached to the Gamera films. And when they gave it to him, it was kind of a joke. It's like, this is the make or break film for this guy. He's a neophyte director. If it's a failure, we blame it all on him. The film was an unexpected hit. So when they made the second Gamera film, they demoted him. They brought in one of the top directors who turned down the first movie to direct the second film. Of course, it didn't do as well as the first film, so Noriaki Yuasa got his job back on the subsequent films. There's a sort of a mythological story, one of those larger-than-life Hollywood baloney stories about how Gamera was created. And the president of the studio has the most apocryphal story, which is he was sitting in a plane coming back from one film festival or another in the United States or Europe. A lot of the early Daiei films were the biggest award-winning films at the international festivals like Rashomon and Gate of Hell. So he was flying back to Tokyo and looked out of his window, and there's two contradicting stories that have been told by people who worked on the films. One was he looked out the window of the plane and he saw a cloud that looked like a turtle. And he said, oh, a flying turtle, that would be something for a movie. And there's another one where he saw an island down below that kind of looked like a turtle, and the same result on that one. And allegedly he came back to the studio, got off the plane, ran into the studio, flipped the doors open in the literary department and said, write a script, write a treatment about a flying turtle. And one of the fledgling writers there said, okay, and he spent a few hours before lunch that day banging out rough treatment. and turned that over as a fire-eating turtle destroys Tokyo. And the director, actually the president of the studio, this man Masaichi Nagata, said, let's make it. That's one of the stories. That's the patented story that some of the old timers tell. The truth is a little different. Daiei wanted to do their own kind of a Godzilla film. But they decided what they wanted to do is, since they released The Birds, Hitchcock's The Birds in Japan, and that was a huge hit, they said, animals gone crazy is what we want to do. So they wanted to do a movie about giant rats. Mutated, I think they were mutated by a chemical, dumped into the sewers, kind of like The Host, but you get these giant rats. They shot a bunch of footage. They had a script, they had a cast. They started shooting the effects footage first using live rats. They used wild rats because the ones you buy in a store, they don't look too terrifying. They don't act about menacingly. They just kind of sit there and all they do is have sex. So since these other rats were docile, they decided to, the studio decided to put a notice out to reward people for catching rats and bringing rats to them, wild sewer rats. So they had all these sewer rats, put them on miniature sets, and had them run about, and they filmed all this footage. And they couldn't get the rats to cooperate. The rats would fight. They would kill each other. They were not cooperating. They weren't good actors. And they even did something that was pretty cruel, one of the effects guys on the film. I'll leave him nameless so PETA doesn't come after him, because we don't need Jenny Garth getting anyone else into trouble. And what they did is they had certain plates, metal plates that they put on the set, and they ran electric current to make the rats jump around. So eventually what happened is the neighbors to the studio were very concerned with the fact that they heard about all this rat business. They called the equivalent of the Japanese health department, and they shut down the film. Because of the animal cruelty that was done on these animals during the effects testing footage, or whatever it was it ended up being, because we'll never know what it is. The footage has been destroyed, and the trailer still existed for this film, but it had been suppressed for a long time. And when Daiei was absorbed by Katakawa Pictures a few years ago, they had it destroyed. So that's how Gamera came about. They said, well, the rats aren't going to work. What do we do? Well, let's just do a Godzilla picture. We'll put a guy in a suit. And that's how Gamera was born. So a lot of people ask, why a turtle? Not very frightening, not very menacing. Well, Asians look differently at turtles than the modern Westerner. Both in Eastern and Western philosophies in ancient times, the turtle or the tortoise was a sign of longevity, strength, and also not only just longevity, but determination, the will to never give up, and so on. While the Japanese also think that turtles are cute, there's a more immediate connection between the modern Japanese and the ancient Japanese. And it goes all throughout Asia, these turtle myths that come from India, about how the world is just the belly of the turtle, and the cosmos is the shell, and it's supported by 4 elephant legs. And there's also the turtle that has the world resting on its back, and so on throughout all these different cultures that seem to have come maybe from Greece and went into India, and then through India to China, and from China to the rest of Asia and Japan. So they think very differently about turtles. Of course, at the same time, the Japanese will take something that's seemingly terrifying, like some wild animal or a mythological creature, and they also apply kawaii to that. They apply cute to almost anything. So while some people might think, and it's not like the Japanese just buy the giant turtle thing, to them it's sort of like, oh, that could be plausible if this stuff actually existed in reality based on their mythology and their culture. But there's still Japanese that go like, oh yeah, giant turtle, who cares? That's lame. The Gamera films have always sort of been associated with children because of the casting in some of the later films after the first one. And people ask, was the first film aimed at kids like the other films were immediately? And it's a kind of a yes and no answer. They wanted to come up with a giant monster film since Toho was putting theirs out, which were made for general audiences at that point. So they did, but Noriaki Iwasa, the director, and the writer said they did make concessions because of the main character being a kid, to aim it at children, but also make it fun for the entire, family, so to speak. When they noticed that the character really appealed to children far more than adults, they started gearing the film directly to them with each subsequent release more and more. The first Gamera film was produced as an A picture with a B budget. So when they produced the second film, because of the first film's success, they gave it an A budget and an A director, and it performed worse than a B movie. At the box office. It just didn't appeal to kids. Kids were bored. There were too many long sequences with the character development and the adults running around and not enough monster fighting. So kids in the theater were running around and screaming and all this stuff that kids do when they're bored in a movie theater. And the producers took note of this and went, we got to put more monster scenes in there. We got to keep the kids interested. So they did gear the films more towards kids, starting with Gamera versus Gyaos, the third film. And that's when it really took off. And that was right at the height of the monster boom as well. Unlike Toho, when they produced the first Godzilla film and the first string of films, there was very little associated ancillary product, very little merchandise, aside from a comic book adaptation or articles in boys' magazines. By the time you get to 1966 and you have the monster boom happening and all these monster toys being released by the Marathon company at the time, and various model kits and products and all this were coming out, Daiei had kind of a jump, because when they released Gamera out of the gate in 1965, in 1966 they started releasing products simultaneously with the film. They had monster figurines and model kits and things of this nature, and a calendar for 1967. They had the Daimajin and Gamera calendar, and things like this. So they did do the merchandising right out of the bat. The merchandising was basically kind of low-key, though. It's not what we see now, where they merchandise the hell out of something like Star Wars, where you can have every single background character in a figure. The Japanese would just go, oh, we just need to make one Gamera soft vinyl doll and a couple of model kits, and that's good enough. And that was the extent of the merchandising, but there was merchandising, because the children were really, really keen on buying these soft vinyl toys. But they kind of fit in with that whole line of merchandising that was coming out at the time. A lot of people would always argue, especially when I was a kid, we were watching all these movies on local television. You would have Monster Week and the 3:30 movie on the East Coast. I think it was the 4:30 movie on the East Coast and the 3:30 movie on the West Coast on the ABC affiliates, and they would do Monster Week or Giant Monsters Week or Japanese Monsters Week, and there was a huge explosion of these films being syndicated, and they were huge ratings hits. So you had all the Godzilla films, and of course everybody considered Godzilla really the king of the monsters. And some kids and some of my friends at school, I loved all these things equally, and I would argue with these people. They go like, Gamera's lame. 8-year-old arguments with people, And, so a lot of people in the United States, a lot of the kids that I grew up with, I certainly didn't know what was going on in adults' heads, and they thought it was all mush anyway. They thought all this stuff was hokum, whether it was the best Godzilla film or the lamest Gamera film or whatever. There's certainly, I shouldn't be saying lame, but there's certainly lamer Japanese monster movies than Gamera, like the aforementioned X from Outer Space and Monster from a Prehistoric Planet, are certainly a little lower on the food chain, but still have their entertainment value. But so as kids, we argued who was better. I loved everything equally. I embraced everyone. But adult fans, as I started getting a little older and reading the fan press, something like Cinefantastique and some of the other higher brow magazines that really analyzed fantasy films, and they pretty much dismissed everything, but they thought that Gamera was the nadir. A lot of that was the exposure Americans had through cropped, pan and scan, faded 16mm prints, because those were released directly to television, while Toho stuff were released theatrically. and were huge, gigantic hits. And even if you look back in the old varieties when these films were first released, the Toho films would get pretty darn good reviews from a magazine like Variety, you know. But so Gamera's always had a hard, bad rap in the United States in the pantheon of giant monsters. It seems that Toho's monsters all rank above Daiei's monsters, just right off the bat. It's not sort of like Godzilla's here, Gamera's here, Rodan's here, Mothra's here. It's sort of like Godzilla, Rodan, Mothra, Ghidra, etc., etc., etc. Column A, Toho, and then column B down here is Daiei. Gamera's getting a little more respect today. And basically the same kind of trip was happening in Japan. And also with, people who were, fans of this stuff that were a little more adult, I guess you would say. And they always felt that Toho was king, because of Eiji Tsuburaya and Eiichiro Honda and the quality that Toho put into all their films in the early, series of films that they produced from the 50s through the 60s. And Gamera kind of got a bad rap in a way, but there are people who are like the hardcore Daiei, fans, Gamera, Daimajin fans, and there's the hardcore Toho fans, and there are the people who like it all the same equally. But yeah, Toho is still king even in Japan. Most people are familiar with Gamera today in the United States from Mystery Science Theater 3000. There's a whole generation that was exposed to Gamera because of them. But how did Gamera get a foothold in America in the first place that led Joel and the crew to find these movies? During the 60s, AIP and other companies were having a lot of success releasing the Toho monster films. So other companies were looking to snatch some of these up and get a piece of the pie, so to speak. A company out of New York purchased Gamera directly from Daiei, the first Gamera film, and released it to theaters in the United States and gave it a huge ad campaign, allegedly in their ballyhoo. We spent $1 million on advertising. And they had this whole campaign. If you remember the end of the first film, they used Plan Z to stop Gamera. So that was their ad campaign and their tagline, will Plan Z stop Gamera, the Invincible? And it did really well. They also did a 45 tie-in for radio stations to play. They had Gamera, the song. You don't hear it in the version that was done by Sandy Frank and made famous on infamous on Mystery Science Theater. But there was this song done by Les Farrell, who also later is well known for writing songs for the Partridge Family. And he had a bunch of different hit songs. So he put this group together called the Moons. It was kind of a Beatles surf kind of thing, a riff on the Ventures. And they did this song where it's just a recurring chorus refrain of Gamera, Gamera. I'm not a professional singer. Gamera. And they had the vocal version, and the flip side of the 45 is the instrumental version. So the other version just doesn't have anybody saying Gamera over and over again. That was put at the beginning of the film, and it was put at the end of the film. And that was another way they pitched the film to audiences by local radio stations to get the teenagers to want to see Gamera the Invincible. So the film actually did really well. For some reason, this company didn't acquire any further Gamera films, and they were not released to theaters. I think AIP saw, and Sam Arkoff, man, old Sam went, these guys are trying to cut into our business here. So what he did is he made a deal with Daiei. They approached him and said, we'll buy every one of these things you make. Just keep making them. And they basically went into a production deal with them to keep producing the Gameras. And they said, the one thing you have to do, AIP told Daiei, why don't you put a couple Caucasians in all these movies because it'll sell better to American television. And that's why you have all these Gamera movies where you have, the American kid and the Japanese kid, after the third film. In every picture, there's it's a mixed race cast because Sam Arkoff at AIP pre-bought all the pictures. And that's how we were exposed to Gamera in late 60s and 70s were mostly the AIP versions. that were just ran over and over and over again with these crazy titles like Destroy All Planets and Attack of the Monsters and Gamera versus Monster X. And so they became successful in syndication because if you put anything on, whether it was Godzilla, Gappa, it could be the best one, it could be the worst one, they got stellar ratings on all the local television stations, and some of them being network affiliates. They weren't all shown on like a UFH station. These were being shown prime time, 6 o'clock at night. Different horror hosts across the country ran these things to death, and they were all popular. And when AIP's rights sort of lapsed and Arkoff sold off a lot of the holdings of AIP to Filmways in '79, they disappeared. And then enter Sandy Frank. Everybody knows him from like butchering Battle of the Planets, the animated series produced by Tatsunoko Studios, which was Gatchaman in Japan, and a big franchise. But again, you know, he made that really popular. You know, he took a Japanese show, he put in all this replacement animation to remove the parts where they were gouging people's eyes out and cutting people's heads off. It wasn't really that extreme, but there was a lot of violence, too much violence for American children's television in America in the late 70s. And so, you know, Sandy Frank just wanted to acquire some more, you know, Japanese product, and, you know, he started bringing this stuff over. And, you know, you're not going to spend $1 million hiring like Christian Slater or some top actor to, you know, Disney does that with Miyazaki. But, you know, are you really going to take a giant monster picture and, you know, hire top flight talent to do the dubbing? AIP was very lucky during the time when they were dubbing films, even, you know, and not just AIP, but other companies. You'll hear the same voices in the, you know, the AIP Toho films, their versions of it, as you would in a Sergio Leone spaghetti western. It was the same crew at Titra Studios in New York. But who could afford them? You know, you go to a cheaper guy, you know, and so Sandy Frank had these things dubbed cheaply. A couple of them were dubs that Daiei already had done, commissioned in Japan. And he started syndicating those on USA Network. Some of them were shown on Commander USA in the mid-'80s. And a lot of people were reintroduced to Gamera that way. And what happens next is Mystery Science Theater, man, which just made Sandy Frank a household name. For better or worse, but God bless Sandy Frank, because if he didn't do those, it wouldn't have allowed Mystery Science Theater to show them. And yeah, a lot of people make fun of Gamera because of Mystery Science Theater, or think that they're really terrible movies no matter what Akira Kurosawa version you show them of that. But if it wasn't for Mystery Science Theater 3000, people wouldn't be talking about Gamera at all. So God bless Sandy Frank. After the movie in 1980, after the debacle of Super Monster, Gamera kind of went to bed for a little while. And a few years later, there's a new generation. Toho was producing a string of Godzilla films that were coming out every year in the 1990s. And they said, let's bring back Gamera. And again, the idea was, let's make a 60-minute film, very conservative, Daiei, very, very, very conservative. Let's make a 60-minute film for kids. You know, Gamera is the friend of children, let's do that. And they were going to hire Noriaki Iwasa again to do it, and they hired the original writer who created Gamera in tandem with the producer. And, you know, I don't think it would have been a good film. In steps a director named Shusuke Kaneko. He was this up-and-coming filmmaker of note in Japan at the time. He had directed a film with Brian Yuzuna. He did a segment of Necronomicon, which was a movie, anthology film released in the early 90s. And he did, I think it's the episode called Cold Sleep that Kaneko did. And a lot of people said, this guy's up and coming. So Kaneko, who grew up with these films and was like a fanboy turned director, he got into filmmaking because he loved Godzilla and Gamera in these films. He loved Godzilla more than Gamera. But he saw this as his in, because Toho wasn't going to let anything in. There was still the old guard. They still had this hardcore studio system. They didn't promote people very well or very often in the studio. And certainly if you were outside director, you weren't going to get in. So he approached Daiei with a radical pitch. He said, why don't we make this a very adult film? Why don't we do a dark spin on Gamera? And I'm going to bring this guy in, Shinji Higuchi, who's going to do the effects. And this guy was a storyboard artist. He worked on a very important anime film in the mid-'80s. It was released in the United States and acclaimed all over the world, called Royal Space Force Wings of Honeyyamas. And he also eventually became the storyboard artist for Evangelion, working with the director Hideaki Anno, who was the creator of Evangelion. So Higuchi is this big, raw talent of special effects genius in terms of like shooting the old school style Japanese special effects. They said, you give us a decent budget, you let us have some creative control, and we're going to make a really great film. Because they felt that the Toho films that were coming out at the time, the Godzilla films in the 90s, just was Toho being lazy, and they just were, because they had no competition, they didn't have to try harder. They said, let's try harder with Gamera. They produced a film called Gamera Guardian of the Universe. I think Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert gave it a thumbs up. At least Roger Ebert did. It was distributed in the United States. It got some theatrical showings, a little roadshow tour, got good notices. People came in to the San Francisco screening of that film. I had previously seen it, but I wanted to see it with an audience, and I had some excitement and a lot of trepidation that they were just going to ridicule the film from the get-go, and because people do that and not actually watch the film. They're there to just yell things at the screen. Thanks, Mystery Science. But seriously, the audience fills up and people are doing, Gamera is really neat, Gamera is full of turtle meat, you know, and there's this thing going on before the film, the lights go down, picture starts, and people are still kind of like making little quips. And there's the first scene in the movie is in a storm, there are these guys running on a dock, and they jump on this small boat, and they're turning on the radio. One guy, you hear one guy scream in the background, the other guy's like calling for a SOS, help, help, help. All of a sudden the roof of the boat tears off and he screams and it cuts to black. The audience goes silent and they go with the film. Now again, it's the giant turtle film, but this one where the audience didn't ridicule the film during it. They found nothing to ridicule after that opening scene, like punched them in the gut. Now I'm not saying it's the greatest monster movie ever made, but it's certainly the best Japanese monster film in years. The success of that film, it won a number of awards in Japan, which was strange because these films, as popular as they are, even in Japan don't win a lot of awards. It sweeped a lot of different awards. Kinema Junpo, one of the most important film journals in Japan, gave it a Blue Ribbon Award, and the director got awards. The actress who debuted in that film, not debuted, but she went from a supporting actress in other films to a leading actress in this film. She won an award, etc., etc. So they quickly produced another film, but with quickly usually means cheap. They produced a really good, higher quality, and even better film than the first one. The second film, Gamera, to the advent of Legion, or Attack of Legion, and that led to them working on this, the penultimate Japanese monster movie. I think it's the penultimate monster movie of all time, Japanese monster movies. Gamera 3, The Revenge of Iris. This film is insane. It's the perfect combination of CGI, men in suits, and seamlessly blending all this together with live actors and scenes shot on location. The story is great, and the scenes are pretty intense, and we did a premiere screening of that in, the film came out in 1999, and we ran it at the Egyptian Theater in the summer of 1999. With both Gamera directors in attendance, Noriaki Yuasa, who did the original films, and Kaneko doing the third film in his trilogy, having its US premiere for the G-Fest convention, which is mostly based in Chicago. They were in Hollywood that year. The screening, packed theater. Effect sequences in the film were getting standing ovations. People were jumping out of their seats and applauding. One scene involved this whole neighborhood being essentially sort of like firebombed by the monsters, and people being swept up in the air in this big fireball and being killed. And people leapt to their feet and were going, whoa! They were just blown away. And the director turned and said, why are they applauding these people being killed on screen? And they had to explain to him that, no, they're not applauding the content of the scene, they're applauding the execution of the scene. The film is pretty tremendous. And again, it got sort of these limited roadshow bookings by another video label, is now defunct. And people really kind of had their minds changed. In fact, these films rivaled Godzilla, so it brought Gamera up to another level, you know, and turned it into this darker thing than what we got. We got a real flip of the coin. So do yourself a favor and try to find those movies, but if Shout Factory puts them out, then you really need to buy them.